In this Future Cities Africa episode, we explore the findings from Good Governance Africa's 2024 Governance Performance Index, examining local governance across South Africa's 257 municipalities. We discuss the effects of political instability on service delivery and leadership, the disparities in citizen satisfaction, and what can be done to improve municipal performance. My guest today is Pranish Desai, a senior data analyst within the Good Governance Insights and Analytics program at Good Governance Africa. Pranish, welcome. It's lovely to have you on the show. Can you elaborate on how the current political instability, particularly evident in hung councils, is impacting service delivery within South Africa's local governments, and what strategies are being proposed or implemented to address this issue?
So, ever since the 2016 local government elections in South Africa, the role of coalitions has become, an increasing debate within public forums, whether it's citizens, the private sector, the public sector, and how to address this, new phenomenon in our politics, or seemingly new phenomenon. What's very important to keep in mind is that coalitions, or hung councils rather, are built into our political system. So during the transition to democracy in South Africa, the political system which was settled on was proportional representation. And the way in which proportional representation works is that the amount of allocation you get in parliament or in a municipal council or in a provincial legislature after an election is in proportion to the proportion of votes you got in an election. So say you got 25% of the vote in an election, you'd expect to get 25% of representation there or thereabout after the election. And over time, those systems tend to produce coalition governments or hung parliaments or hung councils where no single political party can command an outright majority. What we've been seeing in South Africa over the last 10 years is that due to the electoral decline of the African National Congress, coalitions are becoming more prominent at every level of government. And, heading to this year's national and provincial elections, they'll become a feature there as well. After 2016, with the increase in hung councils, what was also noticed was that there's growing instability in municipalities that have hung councils. So the classic case between 2016 and 2021 were cities like Johannesburg, Tshwane, and Nelson Mandela Bay. And then what happened nationally after the 2021 local elections was you again had a big increase in the number of hung councils. So I think you went from around just under 30 to over 80. So it's really increasing and at a rate that's faster than our current, legislative framework seems to be able to adequately manage. Now, what has been happening is that in areas where coalitions are present, or hung councils rather are present, there's increasing political instability, partly because political parties are clearly unable to deal with this in a particularly mature way. So what you often see is a lot of tit for tat. If you voted against me after the election, I'll make sure that I bring some of your current allies to my side and I'll vote against you. And then you'll be out of council. Now, the governance impact of that is that due to the instability, municipal officials are increasingly unsure what decisions to actually implement. It's much harder now to pass things like budgets, which are critical for the functioning of basic services, or building new infrastructure or maintaining infrastructure, addressing concerns like potholes, or paying off key municipal officials for departments. These things, there's increasing instability there, and that has a governance impact. What we're seeing, especially in South Africa's economically dominant Gauteng province over the past few years, is that, governance problems, it's taking longer and longer to address, primarily because there's a lot of uncertainty around who's actually making the decisions and with what authority, and for how long will those political officials actually be in place before, another party actually comes in for a brief period of time. And so a lot of this churn is having a governance impact, and citizens are increasingly seeing that in the quality of services that they're getting, even in, historically advantaged parts of South Africa like Gauteng province.
The report highlights a significant disparity in citizen satisfaction levels across provinces, with the Western Cape exhibiting notably higher satisfaction rates compared to others. Could you delve into the factors contributing to this discrepancy and how they correlate with governance performance indicators?
across the board, citizen satisfaction with municipal governance is quite low. The Western Cape does have the highest average municipal satisfaction over a 10-year period between 2010 and 2011, but it's only around 43%, which means less than half of citizens in that province that was sampled by the Human Sciences Research Council were satisfied. The national average is 30%, so only 3 in 10 South Africans over that same time period were satisfied with municipal performance. There does appear to be some relationship between municipal satisfaction levels and the quality of governance in a province. So to use two examples, the Western Cape is the province where GJ observes the highest average municipal functionality when we assess the extent to which municipalities are fulfilling their constitutional mandate, especially with regard to key dimensions of governance like administration, planning, monitoring, and evaluation, leadership, and especially in the South African case, service delivery. The Western Cape does tend to score highest on average, and it also seems to have the most satisfied citizens, albeit not at a very high rate in terms of the overall satisfaction level. At the other end of the spectrum, you have the Northwest municipalities, which on average scored the weakest. This is not a particularly surprising finding because roughly 40% of the province's municipalities are actually under provincial administration at the moment. And there, only 19% of citizens across that 10-year period were satisfied with the quality of municipal performance in those areas. In terms of accounting for these discrepancies, there's a couple of interesting factors. So one is the history of South Africa still plays quite a significant role in determining both municipal functionality and the way in which citizens are perceiving local government performance. So from a governance functionality perspective, so what the objective reality is, what you do see is provinces that have historically been advantaged in South Africa, like the Western Cape or Gauteng, tend to do better on, indexes like the Governance Performance Index. And one of the reasons is, there was historically greater resources that were allocated to these areas. And over time, even in the post-apartheid and democratic era in South Africa, it also means that these sorts of areas have greater incentives to offer the most talented municipal officials to actually stay in their areas and, work in their municipalities. At the other end of the spectrum, you have a lot of areas that were formerly governed by homelands. And these are predominantly rural provinces like the Eastern Cape, Limpopo, Northwest, and Mpumalanga, and KwaZulu-Natal. So these municipalities, the municipalities in these provinces often have a strong historical infrastructural deficit that they need to, make up for. And it's quite interesting to note that the 5 provinces where municipal satisfaction on average is the lowest is these provinces which had former homelands as a large part of their areas. So quite clearly, there are some legacy effects that are still at play. Another important consideration is political geography. So urban centers tend to do better than more rural municipalities. And some of these effects might be seen in the fact that perhaps municipal councils find it much harder to stretch their authority the less densely populated an area is. So here it's about the incentives that are there to ensure that infrastructure is maintained and built up. If you look at the GPI, the 2 provinces where municipal functionality is the lowest are the Northwest and the Northern Cape. Both are quite dry, arid, sparsely populated areas. And, that geography might be having an effect. If you look at a municipality like Beaufort West, which is in the Western Cape, the, province where municipal functionality is the best on average, they actually perform a lot closer to municipalities in the Northern Cape and the Northwest, where they also dry, arid, it's that Karoo area. And, Beaufort West performs about how you'd expect the average municipality in the Northern Cape or the Northwest to perform, as opposed to the province where it's actually in Western Cape. So another factor that shouldn't be underestimated is political geography and the interplay of that with history.
Pranish, considering the varying performance levels of metropolitan municipalities, particularly those with hung councils, what are some of the underlying reasons behind their suboptimal scores in key areas, such as leadership and service delivery? Are there common challenges these municipalities face?
one reason why coalition chaos has become a buzzword in South Africa over the last 6 or 7 years is that the chaos has been present in some of the biggest cities. And biggest cities tend to be where media houses are. And so if media houses are seeing the instability in front of their own eyes, that tends to drive up narratives. So cities like Johannesburg, Tshwane, Nelson Mandela Bay, eThekwini, Durban, if they're experiencing instability, then that means that, media houses will pay more attention to that than if, say you have 5 hung councils in the northern KwaZulu-Natal that are actually performing okay. Because, there's not that much media coverage or attention on those 5 little municipalities in the northern KZN. But there have been some significant challenges, and some of them linked to the fact that municipal officials don't quite know what decisions to implement due to a lot of turbulence. But another component of it is that political parties aren't using all the best mechanisms that are available to them to ensure that there is stability of some sort. So there's an interesting case study whereby after the 2016 local elections, the 3 big Gauteng metros, those are Johannesburg, Tshwane, and Ekurhuleni, all of whom have about the same population size. They're all in the 4 million to 5 million range, there or thereabouts. Each of them had hung councils for the first time in South Africa's democratic history, but they dealt with it in different ways. So, for example, Johannesburg and Tshwane opted to not have formal coalition arrangements. Instead, what they had was something called confidence in supply, where votes happen on a case-by-case basis. So maybe parties can vote together on budgets, but if it's on municipal appointees, they can oppose that. So that creates an element of uncertainty, even though you have a sort of informal arrangement in place there. By contrast, Ekurhuleni went for a formal coalition arrangement. And what that meant was between 2016 and 2021, there was a lot more clarity among coalition political parties about what to expect and when. The public knew more or less who to hold accountable for decisions that were being made, whereas in places like Johannesburg and Tshwane, there was a lot of mayoral committee churn. And so the public actually wasn't sure who to actually hold accountable for the problems that were taking place. And what you also see in indexes like the GPI is that due to the better performance Ekurhuleni had between 2016 and 2021, it's moved ahead of its Gauteng peers, Johannesburg and Tshwane. So if you look at 3 really important indicators of municipal functionality, Johannesburg, Tshwane, and Ekurhuleni were all more or less scoring the same in 2016. And these 3 indicators are overall audit opinions, the quality of your water systems, and the quality of your wastewater systems. So in 2016, all 3 are more or less doing the same. In 2021, Ekurhuleni had improved on all 3 of those indicators, due in large part due to the formal coalition arrangement. Johannesburg had done better on some and worse on others, and Tshwane was doing worse on all 3. So quite confidently, we can say that formal coalitions don't make things much worse because of the case study of Ekurhuleni. Unfortunately, after the 2021 local elections, Ekurhuleni also didn't pursue a formal coalition arrangement further, and we're starting to see slight regressions in its performance. So, for example, about a month ago, its most recent audit opinion was stable, and there was a slight regression in its overall audit outcome. And one reason was that it took much longer actually this time around for the Municipal Council to table its official audit report to the National Treasury and thus for the Auditor General to vet. So what's also happening is that the timeframes for these funds are elongating, and that's contributing to governance struggles.
Let's move on to solutions. What initiatives are being pursued to improve the governance structures?
One somewhat fortunate development in the recent few years is that due to the instability in major cities, the national government in South Africa is paying more and more attention to the problem of coalitions. So the South African Local Government Association commissioned a framework into how to best stabilize hung municipal councils where no party has the outright majority. And that report's come up with a number of, recommendations. Some of them contain things like professionalizing the public service so that even if there's political instability, your public officials are actually competent and effective enough to make sure that the day-to-day governance can occur regardless of whether the mayor is facing a motion of no confidence this very evening. There are other aspects of it. So, the idea that coalition arrangements should A, be formal, as we discussed in the example of Ekurhuleni earlier, but B, that they should be publicly available. So the public now has a mechanism on which they can actually hold political parties accountable to. Those are two very important initiatives, and hopefully we see them come through in legislation. The national department responsible for local governance management, the Department of Cooperative Governance and Traditional Affairs, have indicated that they want a new system to be in place that takes into account how municipal councils ahead of the 2026 local elections, when we would expect the number of town councils to increase even more than they currently have been. From a citizen's perspective, there are also things that citizens need to do, to best equip themselves to deal with this coalitions era. For example, citizens need to increasingly, apply a bit of political pressure on their ward councillors. Every citizen has a ward councillor, to ensure that they are putting pressure on their own political parties to make sure that stability and predictability become, more prominent factors in the way in which South Africa is dealing with coalitions. Citizens actually do have the ability to, play a role in making sure that political parties start behaving in a more responsible way, at least at the local level, because ward councillors are directly elected by citizens. By contrast, at the national and provincial elections, MPs and members of provincial legislatures are not actually accountable to the public directly in that way. And so, there are more reasons why there are bigger barriers for entry for citizens if South Africa gets a national or provincial coalition government down the line. But at the local level, at least, there are mechanisms whereby citizens can play more of a role. And not only is it, placing more political pressure on ward councillors themselves, but it's also in citizens getting more involved in existing institutions like ward committees, where we've seen participation rates by citizens dwindling in recent years. And that's also been accompanied by a general decline in the satisfaction which citizens have with South African democracy. So from a governance perspective, from a political party's perspective, from a citizen's perspective, there are a number of things which each of these arms and critical arms can do to make sure that hung councils are better managed in the future.
The GPI rankings for local municipalities reveal disparities not only across provinces, but also within different municipality types: secondary cities, large towns, small town, mostly rural. Could you provide insights into the systemic issues contributing to these disparities? And are there any notable success stories or innovative approaches from top performing municipalities that others could learn from?
One thing about the South African system of local governance is that it's very complex, and that's partly a function of how complex South African history is. So, in the late 1990s and early 2000s, what happened was that the National Treasury needed a framework within which to distinguish between different sorts of municipalities, even within the large scale municipal categories that it had identified was the Department of Local Government, as it was called at the time. So what they did is they have three main overarching categories of local government in South Africa. There's category A, which are the big metros. So these are places like Johannesburg, Cape Town, big cities, big budgets, large populations. And they have quite a lot of authority over things that happen in their areas. For the rest of the country, and currently about 60% of the country doesn't live in metros. For the rest of the country, there's a two-tier system of local government, where you have district municipalities, of which there are 44 in South Africa, and they're mainly divided into two types. There's those which have water services authority, and those are usually in the more rural provinces like the Eastern Cape, like your Limpopo's, like KwaZulu-Natal's. And then you have non-water source water services authority category C district municipalities. And these you tend to find in provinces like the Western Cape and Gauteng, which tend to have better infrastructural, frameworks around them. Finally, you have the local municipalities, and these are the closest municipal structures that are to the everyday citizen in most of the country. And there are 205 of those in South Africa. Now, in a lot of provinces, they are responsible for water services authority. In provinces like, Gauteng, the Western Cape, in Mpumalanga, they're responsible for, water services authority, and, provinces like the Northern Cape as well. Now, as my explanations indicated, quite clearly history played a big role in how, these discrepancies were identified by the government in the early 2000s. But even within local municipalities, there's more division than just this water services authority classification. What they did was they classified between secondary cities, which are places like, Stellenbosch, Parel in the Western Cape, or places like Msunduzi, Pietermaritzburg in KwaZulu-Natal. And these are quite populous areas that have quite a lot of infrastructural resources from history, but also quite large budgets due to the amount of population that they actually have to service. Then you have large towns, and these are, again, quite prominent in the slightly more urban provinces, as are small towns. So these are categories B2 and B3. And finally, you have category B4. These are mostly rural municipalities, and you only really find them in provinces like the Eastern Cape, in KwaZulu-Natal, in these sorts of provinces. So across the board, these discrepancies play a pretty big role in understanding how municipal functionality works in South Africa today. But there are areas whereby municipalities in each category have success stories that they can tell, which can lead to improvements in the governance of that area. So if you look at one end of the spectrum, category B4, mostly rural municipalities, there's a municipality called Williemadikizela Mandela Municipality in the rural Eastern Cape. Now, about 10 years ago, they were having major problems with their, financial administration as a municipality. They were increasingly getting the very worst audit outcomes, and that led to a lot of suspicion around corruption. And those, corruption cases were investigated, and, quite a lot was found. But in recent years, that municipality, due to quite effective leadership, and this is where leadership really is important, has actually overcome A, the historical barriers, but B, the barriers that are more recent, like endemic corruption in the council and in the municipal office. And it's actually the only Eastern Cape municipality which has had clean audits for the last 3 years. Now, clean audits doesn't necessarily mean better service delivery, but what it does mean is that municipalities now have more money to actually spend on the right sorts of things. So if you look at a municipality like Winnie Mandela Municipality in the Eastern Cape, they now have more money to spend on things like improving their systems for, refuse removal, which is their core service delivery responsibility as a municipality. And that's a really encouraging sign that, municipalities in the Eastern Cape or KwaZulu-Natal can learn from, actually. At that end of the spectrum, you have the secondary cities, so category B1 municipalities. And if you look at municipalities like Drakenstein and Stellenbosch in the Western Cape, what they're doing is they're leveraging a lot of technology, which leads them to more effective policy making. So, they use things like drone technology, for example, to find, problems within their municipal jurisdiction that need to be addressed, whether it's service delivery concerns or other things, around infrastructure. One specific way in which they're doing this is across municipalities and across South Africa, there's a category of household known as indigent households. These are the most vulnerable and poor households in South Africa. And municipalities are not only responsible for identifying them, but they're also responsible for making sure that these municipalities these poor households get free basic services to a certain level. So what municipalities like Drakenstein are doing is that they're leveraging technology to make sure that they, A, better at identifying these households that are needy and are vulnerable, and B, better leveraging their municipal systems to ensure that they're actually able to service these poor households with more than the national requirement of what you need to give these poor households for. So the use of technology is something that municipalities in data resource areas can start to look more to do in terms of how they can actually improve lives for citizens in their areas.
The distinction between Water Services Authority and non-Water Services Authority districts shed light on differing governance dynamics. Could you elaborate on the implications of this distinction on governance effectiveness and service delivery outcomes, particularly in regions with significant populations dependent on these services? Additionally, what policy recommendations emerge from this analysis to enhance governance in both types of districts?
Water services are perhaps the most critical thing that municipalities across South Africa are responsible for. And this has two real components to it, Water Services Authority, the name. A, there's a component of it called, water services themselves. So the quality of water in a municipality. There we have something quite useful called the Department of Water and Sanitation's relaunched drop program reports. So the one for water is called Blue Drop Report. Then on the other end of the spectrum, you have the Green Drop Report, and that will test the quality of sanitation systems, and that looks at the quality of wastewater system management in a municipality. So you have these two, critical reports that give you a good indication of what the state of, water and wastewater quality within municipality is. That plays a quite key role because of South Africa's two-tiered system of local government outside the metros, whereby in certain provinces you have local municipalities primarily responsible for water services, but in other provinces you have the districts who are responsible for water services. And as I said, the provinces where the districts are responsible for water services are your Eastern Capes, KwaZulu-Natals, Limpopos, where they were formerly governed by the Homeland System. So it's really critical that the citizens in these areas get good access to safe drinking water, safe sanitation water, because that reduces the, prevalence of quite fatal diseases like diarrhea or cholera, among other things. So it's really important that these municipalities get things right. Now, in terms of what is being done and what can be done from a policy-making perspective. So what was identified quite early on in our system of local government was that the districts in more well-resourced provinces like the Western Cape and Gauteng actually don't have much to do, whereas the districts in provinces like the Eastern Cape and KZN, where the problems are really acute, actually have quite a lot to do. So they're different classifications of municipality and they resourced in different ways. One area of concern was that despite the fact that they don't have much to do in provinces like Gauteng and Western Cape, you still have actually quite a big chunk of salary going to these sorts of districts. So I think what the national government has been trying to do in recent years is pilot something called the district development model, whereby these districts in both water services and non-water services areas are responsible for a lot of coordination. So potentially that might, lead to some improvements because you're actually giving the districts across the country more of a defined role. But what might also be helpful is, especially in your more rural provinces, giving some more authority and capacity to the local municipalities, not necessarily over water and sanitation, but, in terms of the sort of resources that you delegate to these sorts of authorities, so that there's greater visibility among citizens that, actually our local municipality has a role that is key beyond, just waste removal. Meanwhile, we know that our districts are responsible for water services. So that's one thing that can be encouraged more and more. The second thing that can be encouraged more and more is a reevaluation of, the role of how water services authorities are determined. So because of the way in which infrastructure has been rolled out in South Africa historically, it means that many provinces still have large areas that don't have things that a lot of people living in cities take for granted, like piped water inside their building or a flush toilet inside their building. So what national and provincial government needs to do here is adequately actually, spend money in addressing these sorts of problems, forget some of these, quite optimistic ideas around bullet trains or whatever, just get to this basic level of human dignity for the households living in your provinces so that you reduce things like diarrhea, cholera that might be affecting people's lives. You don't have these really shocking stories about children in schools in rural areas who have fallen into pit toilets and very sadly passed away as a result. So you're improving the lives of the human dignity of the people living in these areas. And that in turn will lead them to become, have more life opportunities in which they can become, taxpayers in their own right, in which they can, form their own businesses or informal trading settlements or whatever it is, and thus become, more regular participants in South Africa's economy. And that in turn will increase revenues, which can be paid to hopefully better functioning municipalities, who in turn can provide the same residents better quality services. So what organizations like GG exist to do is encourage governments and citizens to create this sort of virtuous cycle where you have good governments that are actually able to deal with the concerns citizens have. And at the same time, citizens are able to hold those governments accountable, because that's the way in which economic development best occurs. So that's something that's very important for South Africa to keep in mind as it seeks to realize some of its developmental ambitions.
A big thank you to Pranish Desai for this insightful conversation on Future Cities Africa.